Well, hello and welcome back to Roundtable Mindset. This is Jamie.
And I'm Malin.
We're back with another episode of Roundtable Mindset when we're talking about some heavy stuff, but I'm hoping it will be educational and enlightening and entertaining.
This one's gonna be a doozy for me. This is one that hits pretty close to home, one that we've been trying to talk about for the longest time, and probably one I'm the most nervous about because I want to make sure the stage is set and that really the understanding from my point of view and this other point of view is really understood. So
yeah, this is an episode 2 years in the making. I mean, really, this is one of the things when we were planning our podcast that we had talked about was a topic we could cover. And it's taken some time for us to really, decide the best route or the best mode to do that in. And so I feel like this is, I'm kind of excited about it because of that, because we really have been, this has been long planned out, well planned. I don't know.
What everyone doesn't know is we've tried starting and stopping this a couple different times as we've been podcasting. So I think we found a good mix. We have to, do a nod back to, so if you're listening to this episode, this one will be, it's a continuation of the previous episode that we had with Being Human AF podcast, where we started talking about narcissism. So I'm just going to throw it out there. The topic today is a continuation of narcissism. And what you're going to hear in this episode is a more tailored personal story. If you remember from the previous episode, I've talked about a family member interaction. I'm not going to name names, but I'm going to go into more detail around my interaction with somebody who I believe is a narcissist. And I do want to make it abundantly clear in this episode, like I did last episode, is that I don't believe this person's ever been diagnosed. I am not able to diagnose them. I'm just trying to figure out the relationship that we've had, and the books that I read, articles I've seen, makes me believe that there are some narcissistic tendencies or behaviors. So when I use verbiage like that, I'm trying to use what I know and what I believe, and based off of these interactions. And we're talking a relationship with somebody 25 years in the making. So this isn't something that I ran into somebody on the street or I've dealt with for even 5 years. This is a very long and painful relationship. So I just kind of want to get that out there so people start understanding how deeply rooted all of this content that we're going to go through really is.
Well, and I think the piece of this episode that is a little different than the last one is we do have an expert joining us today as our guest. And I think that's, important, is to have some good, clean information to insert into these stories and these experiences, because that's how we can understand and know how to cope with it better. So today we have Dr. Krista, who joins us. She's a professor of psychology and has done some clinical work. I've known you forever, Krista. So I'm excited for you to be on the episode with us today. And I just want to give you a little space to introduce yourself a bit and tell us a little bit about your background and what you're bringing to the table today.
Well, I appreciate you having me today. This is a delight, and it is a very difficult topic. I am a licensed clinical psychologist, and I've been practicing for about 31 years, as well as I've been teaching undergraduate psychology, mostly the clinical courses, for about 21 years at a small university. I guess I've also had opportunity to work with a broad range of clients. I have a small private practice still, and I work a lot with community agencies and try to promote increased awareness, decreasing stigma, and trying to increase an understanding without over-pathologizing our world and without creating shame, as well as to promote accurate and helpful information. It seems like in my career that we've gone through many different phases, or kind of either the medication or the disorder of the month, so to speak, with trends of what's recognizable, and sometimes certain things have been inaccurate information. So I hope I can bring some benefit to this discussion. I will be very straight up and promote wellness, but also recognizing that there's trends and there's some difficulties that we also see with not having information about, say, topics like narcissism and people using social media to overdiagnose themselves or diagnose others without accuracy.
Yeah, we've actually talked a lot about that over the last few episodes, haven't we, Malin? About like, if you need a diagnosis, go to TikTok. Because I was talking to somebody about how I kept seeing on TikTok a touch of the tism, and like now everybody has autism or ADHD, and and what's great about that is that it does normalize some of those things that I think people who have some neurodivergent or mental health challenges might experience. But it also, I do think that it can cause some issues with, oh, well, clearly I'm autistic. Well, no, maybe you just don't like the color red. I have no idea, but you know what I mean? It's really fascinating how that's happening right now specifically. But
yeah, and it's part of the reason why this is such a hot topic is that I'm so glad that you're here, Krista, because I do want that source of truth experience. Like, here is what narcissism is. And again, this conversation from my perspective, I'm not looking at the end of it for you to be like, yep, this person's a narcissist and you've been right the whole time. In fact, these conversations, I almost don't even want to focus on, and this is going to sound weird, I'm sure, and I'm just kind of going through my brain. I don't even want to focus on if the person's good or bad, because to me, that's not important in this conversation. In this conversation, I just want to go through the facts as easily as I can, but some of them are very painful and some of them are very deeply rooted. And it's going to be very easy to vilify someone. I just want this to be known, like, this is not the intention of this conversation, because that's also, as we get into it, when I've tried to address this problem directly with this person, it's suddenly I'm vilifying them. I'm making them the problem. And, at the beginning, those tactics worked with me, or on me, I should say. And I would be almost apologizing to the person to say, hey, how you are hurting me, how you're hurting my family. I'm sorry that I even brought it up to you, because obviously I'm wrong. And I think that's kind of one of the main, I'll say, tricks that I found with this person that I had to overcome. So before I keep going down my rabbit trail, I just wanted to kind of call that out there, because this is not about making or painting one person in a bad light and making me look like the good person, because that's been a very sensitive area for conversations with me in the past. So I just want to level set with that, Krista.
And that makes total sense. And that type of insight that you're describing is one of the very things that a person who has a personality disorder in general would not be able to recognize, or they would try to manipulate that. But in particular with narcissism, that dynamic, there's such a lack of awareness and insight, being able to even verbalize your description the way you did, because there tends to be that need to vilify someone and definitely detract from any negative thought about themselves by anyone. That person needs to be right. When we talk about narcissism, that extreme of needing to be right, needing to be in charge, needing to have adoration from others, and just really someone who can describe what you did and not needing to have a villain is different than someone who tends to have narcissism in and of itself.
Well, that's good to hear that you seem kind of like on the right track. So thank you. And if in this conversation, either one of us, I'm going to speak for you, Jamie, but jump in. If we come off that track, please put us back on there, because that is really the intention, because this is going to be, for me, emotionally charged, and it's going to be really easy. And I'm trying to pick my words very carefully. I wrote some things down, some talking points I want to make sure I get to. But I don't want this to be that type of conversation where emotion is the only thing that's driving it, because I know it's going to be part of the conversation. I just don't want it to be the one leading the conversation.
Makes sense to me. And is it okay if I interject just a couple of foundational comments about personalities in general? One of the ways that we can conceptualize personality in general is our typical way of thinking, feeling, and behaving. That's what our personality is, right? And when we talk about someone who has a personality disorder in general, it's where their combination of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors somehow are extreme, where most of us will have those same characteristics, but to the extreme, they can become problematic and they start negatively impacting relationships, ability to function on a daily basis sometimes, or the relationships that are involved in that daily functioning. They may get through their day, but there may be a lot of disruption related to the relationships. Also can create distress. Typically with personality disorders, it's going to be distress for others, especially something like narcissism, because there's going to be such a lack of insight and the need for it to be everybody else's fault if there's anything negative, because they can't handle being wrong, literally. So it's again that extreme. And then also they're going to, within that distress, sometimes project or intentionally or unintentionally promote distress in others. So again, when we think of pathology or something that is problematic with personality or any disorder, we're talking about the extremes, first of all, and then is it if impacting their combination of the 4 Ds, basically creating distress? Is it deviant or atypical from that expected culture? Is it creating dysfunction? Like, is it messing with their relationships, their ability to do jobs, et cetera? And is there danger? So any combination of those would suggest that maybe a personality disorder is present, because we all probably have some narcissism at times. But so again, like you said earlier, Malin, it's those extremes that are going to be recognizable as problematic. So I think just kind of laying that foundation is helpful, because virtually anybody listening should be able to, or probably does, relate to some of the things that we're going to be talking about. Because we have those characteristics, it doesn't mean that you are a narcissist. It's the extremes and where it creates disruption that's a problem.
Thank you for saying that, because I have told Malin a couple of different times. In our work, we have clinical staffing. So we have a clinician that comes in and teaches us things. And I imagine it's like someone who goes to medical school who sits in these staffings. And I'm like, oh my gosh, do I have borderline? Or you know what I mean? Like, because you hear some of those things that are things that you might struggle with, but that difference between it being something that you struggle with here and there, or something that is ruling or controlling your interactions or really disrupting your life, that's the key. And it took me a little bit of time to figure that out, that I'm a human and I make mistakes too, but it doesn't mean that I'm
Exactly.
diagnosable, I guess.
Well, one of the areas, and this is more I'm using you as a sounding board, Krista, because I really do want to know if I'm on the right track, but I'm speaking through experience now and interacting with my parents as I was growing up, specifically my mom in this area. But I remember I was talking to her about, being normal. Like, we don't have a normal family. And my mom was very quick to be like, Malin, what's normal? And so I was trying to justify in my, small mind as a kid, talking to my parents, who I know everything because I'm all knowing and my parents are dumb people, explain to them what normal was. And my mom just kind of looked at me and she said, you realize that everybody has all the different types of personalities within them. It's when one of them is stronger than the other is when problems come up. So she said, and she lists out specific for this conversation, I'm just going to say, she's going to say, you're going to be a narcissist at times. Like, there will be times in my life where I will do something that will reflect a narcissistic person, but that doesn't mean I am a narcissist. That just means I have aspects of them. So I always thought, growing up and getting into my adult years and now getting into my middle adult years, I've kind of just adopted this definition that says I'm healthy mentally because I can recognize that I have aspects of all of those different personality disorders to some degree, but none of them to the point where it's an extreme, like leaning one way over the other. Like, I have almost elements of all of those at some point in times, depending on if I'm stressed or happy, or, no matter what's going on in my life, if it's turmoil, if everything's calm. And I just kind of always thought that's what makes a very well-rounded, mentally healthy person. I know there's a lot in there, and so I'm really kind of broadbanding it. But do you have any response to that? Like, am I off base? I'm sure there's a lot more that I don't know, but I was just curious, like, is that even starting on the right path?
Without a doubt, I believe so. And I think the small detail that's really important is to recognize the difference between personality. So you have all those personality characteristics. So we have a variety of characteristics, of our personality, but it doesn't mean it's a disorder. So like there's narcissism, but it isn't always a narcissistic personality disorder. There is a dependency, but it's not always a dependency disorder. There's histrionic, where a person needs to be the center of attention, but it isn't. We have that sometimes, right? So those are different characteristics, but they're not to the extreme is when it can become a disorder. And it's the extreme presence of those characteristics, of those personality characteristics, but it's also, again, where it starts disrupting their life, or it's atypical for that context and those kinds of things where it is a problem. So I think you're spot on, because we all have different characteristics. We trend towards a personality for ourselves, but it's going to be flexible and different depending on stress levels, who we're with, what the environment is, and those kinds of things. So when a person says, oh, she's a chameleon, well, the reality is a person who has a flexible personality, flexibility, and recognizes that it's okay to be who you are in certain environments, and you're going to have some flexibility in the different environments you're in, is healthy. It doesn't mean your whole sense of self and your whole identity changes because you shift and alter. It's really about what your personality is and how you can deal with different environments.
Yeah, it's funny that you describe it that way, because I always think like there is a level of narcissism in our teenage years, I think, right? Where the world doesn't go much farther beyond the end of our nose, but it seems to be a developmental stage. Like that's where we're supposed to be at that age. And so I think that's a really good way to look at it. I think we kind of, if I can look back over my own experiences, there are times where whatever those responses were met a need or protected me or did whatever it needed to do at that time. Maladaptive as they were, they served a purpose, but it doesn't mean that that's how I always respond to things, or you know what I'm saying? So That's a really good perspective. Thank you.
Definitely. And I think you strike a good point on a couple of ends. Is there are parts of our lifelong growth. There are parts of our development where it's typical to have narcissism. How about that toddler who's me? You know, that, as soon as they're talking, it's about them, and they're so egocentric because it is all about them. You earlier, Malin, asked about like some of the origins of what causes this. There's a lot of theories, but one thing is like, you think of that developmental level where it is all about you. If that is fostered into later development and that person is, say, over, maybe, okay, we'll do in quotes, we'll do like they're the only child syndrome. So they are so over protected, over the emphasis of being overdone, lots of attention, then they could develop a certain type of a narcissism where they feel like they are that awesome. They need to be the center of everything. They are better than everybody else because they've been fed that forever. So they never really develop appropriately beyond that typical childhood development of an experience of having narcissism. Likewise, in adolescence, we revisit that in adolescence. And in the meantime, there's a lot of different things that are happening, of course, but in adolescence, it tends to resurge itself. And again, if it's overemphasized or has been that whole time, it's going to be problematic and could develop some narcissism. That's more like typically described as grandiose narcissism. Then you have the other extreme where it's the individual whose needs aren't met, or they've been severely ridiculed, or maybe there's a history of trauma, or they aren't getting their needs met. And like you said, that's kind of self-protective or a way to get through certain times. But if a person could develop a different type of narcissism that's sometimes referred to as vulnerable narcissism, where they develop this protective need to be and be perceived as wonderful and be the center of everything and be people to know that they're amazing and that they're so self-focused to the extreme because there's like this narcissistic wound. So to overcome that vulnerability, they have to let people know how wonderfully awesome they are. And that can be very overt sometimes, but they really lack insight on both of those veins. They lack insight as to what's really going on and the way they present themselves or how they got there.
Right.
Yeah. One of the last things for me that you said there, though, I want to kind of just touch on, you know, I'm going back in my own childhood now and as a teenager and the battles that I had with my parents, and they're not anything different than any other, adult to teenage conversations. But I remember growing up, there were several times I almost feel like those guide rails get put on there from our parents and from people in our lives to say, hey, you're not as wonderful as you think you are, or it's not always about you, right? Like growing up, I love my parents to death, but they were not bashful to be like, Malin, the world's not real. We're not here to make sure your needs are always met. Like, that's just not how this works. And when I hear you talking, and again, I'm in the space right now that I do not have really any, obviously education or anything, but it just makes me react to what you're saying. And I'm trying to make it more personal to me. I wonder if that's an area where sometimes, and I say sometimes, where those boundaries are meant, as we grow up to kind of keep us in the middle of that lane to say, yes, you will have these tendencies sometimes, but guess what? You need to course correct because here are all these other outside influences trying to kind of help meld what's going to be our lifelong personality and kind of make us that healthy. And so when you're talking, I was doing self-reflection here and I was like, yeah, my parents were not bashful to tell me, you're not that wonderful all the time, Malin, and it's not always about you. And so I wonder if that had some sort of impact on how my personality did shape. So
Without a doubt. I mean, that along with many factors, but when we get direct discussion points about or parenting that says, hey, it's not always about you, we really need those messages in balance. Again, almost everything's okay in moderation. So we need that check-in. And at the same time, that is balanced by our parents with accurate praise, accurate rewards, accurate and healthy boundaries, limit setting, consequences, etc. That along with saying the world doesn't always revolve around you. And if there's hypothetically, if there's a situation where that, hey, the world doesn't revolve around you, but it's not counterbalanced with all the other good stuff that we need to help our egos be strong and to grow and develop healthy minds, self confidence, etc., then we could maybe get some of that, get to the extreme. It could result in some development of narcissism because it's like, oh, the world doesn't revolve around me, but if extreme negativity happens within that, also it could be problematic. But also the individuals who are the parents maybe struggle with how to parent in those situations too. And so that might be it could be a healthy go-to to remind the kid of that, as long, again, as it's balanced with other good stuff, meaning nurturing and structure and consequences and those kinds of things.
absolutely. And I'm looking at the clock and now we're well into 20 minutes. It's so easy to talk to you already. And I'm like, oh, I have so much I want to ask you and we're not even into the content. So I'll go ahead and just jump right in. Then something that you said at the very beginning, Krista, was something about being a chameleon. And that was actually one, as I start my story about my mother-in-law and our relationship, I go back in my notes and I look, the first 2 years of my marriage, my mother-in-law and I's relationship, I'd say I won the lottery. There was no issues. There was no problems. Life was grand. They were around because we kind of lived by them, but they weren't too intrusive. And my wife's family was kind of larger than mine. So there was more interactions, there was more birthday parties, there was more extended family because their family dynamic was different than mine. And I was learning to meld into that new family dynamic. And it was about year number 2 when enough little things, right? Like everything grates on people at some point in time. But it was enough little things that happened. And I'm going to tell you a specific fight that took place. And this is really, I've had to trace this back over the years. And it's come down to this. And it sounds so stupid, but it really was the turning point to this relationship. And I'll never forget, we lived about 20 minutes from my mother-in-law when my wife and I first got married. And she was hosting a party. And she called my wife, and my wife got off the phone and she was upset. And we were in college. We were both working full time. And we actually happened to have a Saturday where both of us were home and we just wanted to relax, watch television, order takeout, just veg, just do what we wanted to do. And I remember she got off the phone and she was almost in tears. I'm like, what's going on? And she kind of told me about the fight that her and her mom had. And then one of her brothers and sisters called. And that really kind of got her going. And I thought, well, this is ridiculous. So I thought, well, I'll just call my mother-in-law and let them know that we're not coming. So I picked up the phone and I called and I was like, hey, and we started talking. And I said, hey, just wanted to let you know that we're not going to be coming down to help you set up for this party. We're doing other stuff this Saturday. And so we're doing our own stuff, but we'll be down tomorrow for the party. When I say 4 hours later, I was still on the phone with her, that is not an exaggeration. And finally, I got to the point where I said, you have a husband and you have 4 children that live with you in that house. You do not need your daughter to come and vacuum and dust and take the trash out and wipe stuff down and, get everything ready when you have other people there that can help you. I said, we are not coming. We will see you tomorrow. And I hung up the phone. From that point forward, my relationship with my mother-in-law started to change in a very drastic way. So I kind of want to pause there and see if you have any questions. But as I do look through the past, I believe the trigger that was for my mother-in-law was I told her no. I somehow shifted in her mind how something was supposed to work, and I prevented that from happening. And because I told her no, what I will refer to as her mask slipped. And it was the first time I saw who I really believe is the person behind the facade that was presented to me for 2 years prior. That really is the start of this relationship going south.
Very well articulated. I guess I'd start with, if that was the only piece of information I knew, narcissism may not be where I go with it. Okay. But given that, along with everything, if narcissism and other factors that I already knew were pointing that direction, some of the key things with narcissists is an extreme inability to accept the word no, or someone disagreeing or believing something different, because somehow that is so threatening to their inner, I'm going to use some psychobabble, but inner psyche. Like, they are not able to tolerate it if somebody stands up to them like that, because it's going to send them quickly to defense mode. Can't handle rejection, can't handle feeling vulnerable. This person just stood up to me. So that would be consistent with one of the components of someone who has narcissism or potentially narcissistic disorder. So that's consistent with that without a doubt. And it could be the trigger point where that person who has a narcissistic tendencies or a disorder would start, like you said, kind of unveiling their mask, because it's unmanageable. It's intrinsically there. They feel threatened because they feel vulnerable because somebody stood up to them. And so, like, questions that I would want to ask you or someone is like, how many people do stand up to her? How many, do the kids just do what she does? Is it, oh, that's just mom, we're going to deal with it? What are some of those kinds of characteristics? And so, like, if you were the one that stood up to her and she's not used to that, it's definitely going to negatively impact your relationship.
Well, and interesting to me, just to jump in here for a second, is it took someone outside of the family, because I think, if you're in that environment with a parent who might have those tendencies or even undiagnosed narcissistic personality disorder, everybody's going to do what they need to do to keep the peace, right? Like, to balance things out and to make sure everything's okay. We don't challenge, we don't do those things. So someone from outside of the family coming in and saying, wait a second, no, we're setting a boundary here. That's interesting. Just knowing Malin for so long anyway.
Well, and what's really interesting for me, Krista, you don't know this, but a lot of the things that you just said are absolutely true. So her other children, because my wife was a product of a first marriage that ended in divorce. And so the second marriage is where her brothers and sisters come from. And there's quite an age gap. So I think it's anywhere from 14 to 20 years is the age gap between my wife and her siblings. So at this time, her kids, I would say one's about ready to get into teenage years all the way down to, I think it was like a 1 or maybe 2-year-old. It's in that time frame. But at that time, and again, I'm speaking very bold, like, I wrote down here, I was 21 when I got married. I was 23 when things started going south. I thought I knew everything. I thought I had a real grasp on the world. But in hindsight, I was not equipped dealing with somebody who had this type of a personality. I just wasn't. So I handled it the best way I did. I wish I could see you right here, Krista, that I handled it beautifully every time. I did not. I absolutely did not. I used the means and the mode that I had within me, being raised by my family. My mom was a very opinionated and strong businesswoman. She told it like it was. Her big thing is, I'm going to tell you the truth. I didn't say I was going to make it pretty for you. And that's kind of what I kind of lean towards is, I'll tell you the truth. You're just not going to like to hear what I have to say. Over the years, I've learned to use more of my diplomatic side, which has helped tremendously. But I'm just kind of laying the groundwork in so you can understand, like, now you have someone who's coming in literally with sledgehammers and wrecking balls because I've had enough. I've had enough. And now I'm starting to understand that there are things being put onto myself, my wife, and ultimately my marriage, which is where now I'm starting to almost wake up to say, this is more than just my mother-in-law was angry because she didn't get help to clean the house. This is a tactic of control. So before I go any further down that, I just kind of wanted to reiterate what you were saying, because up to this point, I truly believe her parents, although they were wonderful people, I don't think they told her no very much. Her siblings, she was the youngest by many years. So for a lot of them, almost helped raise, or they were already out of the house when she was growing up. So she was kind of like this only child kind of situation. And then you look at her own internal family dynamic. She had a husband, or has a husband who, in my opinion, not that a husband is meant to control their wives. That's not what I'm saying. But a husband is meant there just as much as a wife is meant to kind of balance each other out. He didn't do his part to balance, to say, that's not what we should be doing. You need to be thinking things in these terms, or why are you acting like this to the kids? And so I really feel like that lens that she could have really had and would have been helpful from a spouse was lacking. And then the kids were growing up in this environment, so they didn't know any better. So to them, this is all normal. So to kind of land the plane on your point, she didn't have anybody that stood up to her really until I came along. And I do want to pause here, because I think a really great distinction here is, she probably had people in her life that did stick up to her, but they weren't part of the ecosystem that she could just get rid of them, right? Oh, you disagree with me? Okay, well then I don't have to interact with you anymore. And guess what? I can still live in this ecosystem that I'm building. I was the first person who was injected into that ecosystem that was not going to leave. And I was the first one, and from that perspective, that really started saying, no, you're not going to do these things. Your expectations of us or my wife are wrong, and you're not going to get your way. Like, these were the building blocks, all coming from this one simple, it sounds so stupid to say out loud, but this one conversation is really what kind of started breaking all those things apart. And again, hindsight, I'm putting these together to try to understand why was that such a big deal? And so if you have any other insight on that, or, you can think through your experience, what might have been maybe happening there. But that was my take on it, is that it was the first sign where that ecosystem started to fracture, and she was losing, what I'm going to use air quotes, control of the people in it.
The way you described that was very consistent with what would unfold in a situation where there is someone in within an ecosystem, to use your term, or within your family system that has narcissism. First of all, I guess someone who has this narcissistic tendencies to the extreme are going to choose a partner that tends to be more passive. So the reason that relationship even works probably is because that partner doesn't try to balance it out. There's like, this is just who she is, and this is, I love her, or this is just my life, or whatever. It'd be interesting, again, to have more information to dive into, like, what ended that first marriage and what was the dynamic there, because chances are, if there truly is a personality disorder going on, that played a significant impact in that. And the reason this marriage, or that the more passive husband, or the husband that at least doesn't challenge some of this or say no, it's going to definitely facilitate continued behaviors like that. I think you made a good point also with the kids. They didn't know anything different. This was their normal. And your wife then, of course, is trying to still develop and figure out what normal is. And she's seeing what other families did probably in her teen years, maybe. And then as she enters into her relationship with you, is saying like, oh, this is different. And probably reflecting back on how mom always gets her way, or that, yeah, this really isn't consistent with what is a healthy relationship. Typical people can tolerate no. Typical people can tolerate individuals disagreeing with them, or agreeing to disagree. But oftentimes that person with narcissism will have an opinion or be in, said situation, and will be able to tolerate others agreeing with them, will tolerate being able to share their piece, and say, oh, it's okay for other people to have their opinion. But as soon as it's not the narcissist's opinion, then that person's X'd out. That person is not okay. And it's going to then add fuel to the fire, so to speak, like you are kind of describing. That was the, though it seems small, it's a biggie for someone who has narcissism. When that happened, then it did just add fuel to the flame, and it just started the unfolding of the fragile self that she had, especially in regards to you. And she didn't want to be exposed at an unconscious level. Again, she's not actively saying, oh, I need to be in control all the time. She doesn't even perceive or have insight. Most people with any personality disorder don't have insight into it. And so she's not going to understand the dynamic. She might be able to point it out in somebody else, but the emotions and that inner vulnerability are going to minimize her ability to do that for herself.
I think that's really interesting what you said, or at least what I'm hearing you say is that somebody who has this extreme narcissism, or maybe even just narcissism, can recognize narcissism in other people, but they cannot do any type of self-reflection on themselves to be able to say, oh, I might be having the same attributes that I equate to Bob over there as, oh, that's some of the same stuff that I do. I think that is remarkable. I think that is absolutely remarkable. I carried a lot of resentment and anger towards my mother-in-law for many years because I didn't understand what you just said. And even now I'm struggling. Like, I've almost come to peace that I don't want to give her an out, because I think we're all responsible for our behaviors. But I'm almost to a place now where I truly believe this is almost like a disease, like a mental disease. Like, she can't help it. She needs to get some support. And, I use this analogy before we started recording, so I'm going to use it here now. It's hard to save a drowning person when they don't think they're drowning. But even what you just said right there, I'm just like, wow, how can somebody be healthy enough to recognize those traits in somebody else, but not themselves? That seems so odd.
But they're not really healthy enough to see that in someone else. They're bright enough and capable and informed enough, but when it comes to the emotional piece of it, that they can't resist it. And they can't have insight into it because it creates too much vulnerability to them. That's where I referred earlier to like that narcissistic wound. And remember, these are theories because we don't have any way to prove this, but we can unfold several dynamics, and anecdotally we can say, hey, these are typical characteristics. And there is research to also support that these are trends that occur with individuals who have those characteristics of narcissism or narcissistic personality disorder. But when it's a typical way of thinking, feeling, and behaving, it's full of habits. And so there's awareness of what's external, but as soon as it gets too close, as soon as there's emotions attached to it, then there's that threat that they will be discovered that they're not that great. So they need to project this image, and they need to be right, because if they're wrong, they're going to die. Does that make sense? So again, I'm talking figuratively in terms of they're going to die, but that's the inner experience. But they don't have any words or awareness of it to be able to present that or to admit it to themselves. But they can see the dynamic in others because they know it's not okay, and that it's okay for other people to have opinions if it's somebody else. But they don't see that they don't even have awareness typically that they're doing it themselves. So again, not to give people an out, but that's one of the hardest parts of having information, especially related to mental health and like personality disorders, is we might see where someone else might see a person as a monster. We might see this person as, oh, these behaviors are not okay, but I know how they got there because there's this and this and this life experience and this and this. But man, how do we that creates it creates so much dissonance when you have information, because you can know this isn't okay and it's going to destroy lives, it's going to hurt the kids, it's going to damage relationships, but you can still understand it. Doesn't mean they get off the hook, but you can understand it, and it's hard because you can have some empathy because you know how they got there, and maybe there truly is this inner disdain or discomfort, but they aren't even aware of it. It gets a bit hard to conceptualize.
Yeah, that is.
Well, yeah, you had said something about that feeling of, if I'm wrong, I could die. Could you talk more about that, I guess? Because I think that what's interesting to me is that feeling, and I think I'm a fairly mentally well person. I've had challenges over the years. I've worked through those things, and have learned coping skills and things like that. But I do remember spaces of time where things happen, and that inner feeling, that it like activation inside of discomfort. And I guess I hadn't thought of that, because I think so often, even in the spaces where I have been around, I have not gone as far to be like, oh, this person was a narcissist, but definitely some of those tendencies. It always felt to me more like it was, I don't know if it was like vilified or, like it was intentional or toward me or something like that. But I never thought of that inner turmoil and what that must be like. Can you talk a little bit more about that and what that, I guess, why that might cause some of these behaviors?
Well, I think it's really important to realize it's not a cognitive process of like, I'm afraid I'm going to die. There's no cognition to it. It's not logical. It is that inner arousal. And so maybe a silly word picture would be, it's like all those little neurons inside going, ooh, panicky, but there's no language. They don't have language to tell us. And so they're just activating in our neurological system and creating an internal sense of discomfort and like, I'm going to die, that panicky feeling. And the individual isn't even aware that they're so fragile that they can't accept being disagreed with. So that it's not logical. It's not at a very conscious or awareness level at all. It is like the inner, almost the fight or flight process that's happening
just going to ask that. Yeah.
Without a doubt. Yes.
Well, because if you think fight, flight, freeze, or what's the other one? There's one more I can't remember. But, if you think about those, I guess, air quotes, narcissistic abuse spaces, that abuse is at the fight. You know what I mean? Like those reactions, that is what it sounded like. So that's really, really interesting. And I guess helps me understand a little bit too.
And the hard part is there's not anxiety because the narcissism and the awareness is not there. So they don't have anxiety about it, or oftentimes don't even have regret because they don't get it. There's survival.
It's justified.
Yeah. So when you say, fight or flight, and I think Jamie threw out another one, the one that came to my mind with my interaction with my mother-in-law as we keep going, one of her reactions, I would say, is ignite, because she would have disagreements. She sometimes would run away. Most of the time, she lit things on fire. And when I was younger working through this, I would be glad to throw gasoline on there to be like, let's watch it all burn then. But I hope that's a clear enough distinction. I have, but I hope that's a clear enough distinction. Like, she was not afraid to be like, I will set this ablaze. And sometimes when things were too calm, there had to be drama. And that's still a piece. I don't know if that's a different part of her personality, or if that's part of what I believe is the narcissism. But there just seemed like if things were too calm, I'll have to do something to kind of break that up, because I need this drama in my life. It was almost, this is going to sound really crazy, I'm sure, it almost was like a tactic she used to keep control over people, is because if things were going too well, it was like, uh-oh, I almost have to invent a reason for the people in my life to still come back and need me. Does that make sense?
Unfortunately, it does. And it is very consistent. When I alluded earlier to like, if there's other pieces that fit, this is what you're describing does fit. Like there is that need to be, the nice technical term of the pot stirrer. Keep things up in a roar, then you have control. You have a sense of control. And that level of arousal, though they lack insight into it, that level of internal arousal is much more comfortable than having calm. Because maybe then, there's lots of theories on this, but oftentimes then there's that possibility that they might lose control, or they have a sense of losing control, or if they think logically without that fight, flight, arousal system going on, which they're comfortable with, then it's almost as if there's I think that sense of control of the environment, then it keeps people, especially once a pattern is established, they're going to come back and they're going to take it on for themselves, and they're going to apologize, or they're going to try to solve it for the person, and all those things that just reinvent or reinforce that narcissistic chaos.
Yeah, that makes sense. I do have a couple other big events that I'd like to get through, but before I get there, I'm going to just go ahead and talk about a lot of different things. And this is a culmination of years. And by kind of globbing these together, I want to get to my points at the end, which is really around how, when she was being a chameleon, how others were perceiving her. Because one of the things that just drove me absolutely nuts is, for the longest time, nobody said anything. That's just my mother-in-law. And then when you start saying stuff, there's this sense of nobody will believe you because that's not their interaction. And I'm going to pick on Jamie here for a second, but I know, Jamie had a front row seat, and I when I started kind of confiding in somebody just outside of that ecosystem, right? Like my wife and I over here, we're talking, we're dealing with it, like we're a united front. But just to have somebody outside of there to be like, I need to just talk to someone because this is not right. And not to make you feel bad, Jamie, but it was almost like, Malin, I don't see it. Like, that doesn't make sense to me, because that's not, your mother-in-law is wonderful. I think at one point in time, she was referred to as Martha Stewart. Like, it was like, she's the sweetest person.
Literally the most kind, welcoming hostess on the planet. I loved going down to spend time with that family because it was I just felt so welcomed and part of the group from the word go. So yeah, these were really hard for some of these experiences. I was like, well, maybe it was a bad day, or you know what I mean? It just, I didn't see it until, it probably was years later. Several years ago, like, no, maybe there's an issue here. So.
Well, and I don't know if I'll get into it, but what Jamie doesn't know is it took an argument that I was having, and I even said something to the fact of, well, Jamie knows, like I kind of brought Jamie's name up, and from that point, it was almost like I have to surgically remove this person from coming into our life. And then there were some kind things that were said about Jamie to me, and that did not go over very well for my mother-in-law. And so I'm like going through this at like warp space. So I do want to kind of pull ourselves back, and I want to kind of continue through my thought. But before I do that, Krista, did you have any thoughts around that before I begin?
Well, I think that the way I'm going to create a quick analogy is, if you think about your social face and what people know about you when you're in your quote unquote safe space compared to different arenas that you're in. And if you lacked insight and if you weren't capable of thinking about your thinking, so a cognitive level, or if you lacked insight into your own personality characteristics or how you are perceived by others, or how you have a way that you want people to perceive you, and you have a view of how you are perceived, and any situations where you are in public, you want to have that positive impression because you are the best thing that there ever was. You're the best thing since sliced bread if you're narcissistic, right? That's your viewpoint. So you want everybody to know that. And then when there is a split from that, or there's people that start to peel that away, it's very, very scary. And so you're going to get that reactivity. But I want to go back to, I kind of got off task a little bit, is all of us have our social face. So there are so many things that we don't know about Malin, that we don't know about Jamie in our inner world, but even when we're just in a different space. And so think about the things that people don't know about you. So it makes sense that she would be able to hide that from other people, because we hide stuff from everybody all the time, what we want them to see or not see. And if we need to be perfect, we're going to make sure that those people outside of our bubble think that we're perfect. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly what, I mean, you don't know my mother-in-law, you've never met my mother-in-law, but you are painting the perfect picture of my mother-in-law with your descriptions. Like, that's exactly who this person is.
Well, I'm thankful my student loans, got paid off. So all that was worthwhile, that education.
Well, and you can ask my kids. There's definitely, there's a hostess in me, when the daughter brings a new boyfriend over, I am on my best behavior, because that's, that is a piece of that. I think what's interesting is how different that can be for the inside circle and the outside circle, and I think that's what, when Malin was bringing me those stories or the experiences and the challenges that they were facing, it was like, that doesn't even seem conceivable to the outside, the outside person, as opposed to what was happening for those on the inner side, inner circle. So, yeah.
And I think this is a great example of what we referred to earlier of normal. We can relate to this because everybody has their social face, and we know when to put it on and not, if we're bright and capable enough, right? And so we can relate to that, but think of the extremes. I also can tolerate somebody saying, you know what, we're not coming over today. It doesn't mean I'm like going to lose you forever, or that I'm a wicked person, or you hate me, or that you're the worst thing ever. Most people can tolerate that, but we can also relate to, we have the social face. Does that make sense? You just don't have the other extremes that are part of that. And her social face is going to be to the extreme too, because she needs everybody to perceive her in a positive way, or a narcissistic person does.
Yeah, so from that time on, as I kind of put the gas to the pedal now, and years are going by as I'm mentioning these next things, there was really a big uptick in control. I need to now position conversations. I need to position holidays. How do I get Malin and his wife, back to the house, or manipulate situations, create events that they almost have to come. And so from this conversation forward, it's more and more of these types of situations coming. So now, again, the devil's in the details. And if I just would tell one person a story by itself, it'd be like, yeah, I think you're over exaggerating, Malin. So when you string all of these together, so even as I'm blurring past these, like, I just need you to know these are years of interactions. And sometimes, it was one interaction in a month. Sometimes it was 5 interactions in a week. Sometimes, it just kind of varied. But I would say, from that initial discussion I had with my mother-in-law, where I told her no, as we're going through the years, one thing that kind of came to mind was holidays. So my wife and I, we did not have children at the time, but we wanted to spend some holidays by ourselves, or maybe do, Friendsgiving or other stuff. And this is where really guilt was put on us about, oh, you don't want a relationship with your brothers and sisters. Oh, why are you trying to hurt me? You know that holidays are really important, or you're choosing to stay by yourself rather than come with family. How selfish of you. You guys are just so selfish. And why do you want to, why are you trying to hurt me in this way? Have I done something? And so now you have all these different techniques where you're like, okay. And so guilt worked for a little while until it didn't anymore. And then, we kind of grew to say, it's okay for you to feel, you can be guilty or try to guilt us. That's not going to work anymore. And then the next big one that I would say was, we put our foot down and said we were not coming for Christmas. And again, we still didn't have children, but we were like, we'll come after, because we just kind of wanted to be and do our own thing as a married couple. And I'll never forget, I got a call from my parents, and they told us that they accepted the invitation to my mother-in-law's for Christmas, and they were looking forward to come and spending time for the holidays. And
I don't remember this one, Malin. I am what?
Yeah. So I was like, what are you talking about? So it almost forced our hand, because my parents were coming. They were traveling 2.5 hours. so they could spend, and it wasn't Christmas Day, but it was kind of around the Christmas, right? So they were coming, and true to form, my mother-in-law put a huge spread out and fine china and all of these things. It was out of a magazine perfection. The Christmas tree, all the decorations, the food. I mean, it literally came out of a magazine. And the night progressed, and I remember it was all said and done, and my mom looked at me and she said, "I will never come back to this house again, no matter if you or your mother-in-law ask me again." And I was like, whoa. I was like, what's going on? And it was the whole night talking about how wonderful everything was. It was a night spent on, oh, my mother-in-law, how selfless of her to put this together. And my mom and dad were like, we were guests, and yet we were more expected to do the dishes. And they did. They helped out, right? And there's nothing wrong with helping out. But from my mom's perspective, it was, we need to help out, and the whole time praise my mother-in-law for what a hard worker and how nobody really helps her, and this is so hard to do. And so by the end of the evening, my mom was like, I'm done. And because of my wife, my mom said there was some choice words I would have said. Now, again, I'm glossing over a lot, but I just wanted to highlight, you can see the level of manipulation and control. And now it's not even extending to me directly. Now it's going to a place where you bring my parents in, it almost forces our hand to be like, well, yeah, we're going to come. My parents are going to be there. And at that time, I wasn't really divulging a lot of what was going on to my parents. So they were just like, oh, your mother-in-law invited us to come for dinner. That sounds wonderful. We would love to. And how can we say, no, don't come? Because again, it sounds like we say don't come, and we're the problems, and we're the ones that don't want to be around family. And that's not at all the case. But that was really kind of where we've gone over the years in the form of manipulation. And it just keeps going from there.
Well, without a doubt, the pattern that you're describing, I'm going to point out a few specific things, like the all or nothing thinking, the splitting, like you're going to split people against each other almost. Like, okay, you're not going to come, then I'm going to manipulate this by asking them to come. And she has no insight that in reality, now, I bet you would say to your mom, or somewhere in the middle, you would have said, just tell me you can't come, because we already told them we were going to be there. This is just some of her stuff, so to speak. But you actually, one, her control worked in the manipulation, but two, at another level, we become manipulative, or we play the game with the manipulation because we don't want to harm the family system. And then they just get more, we just feed into that power. And that's exactly what happened back then, because in the reality now, well, it was set up for that, because after that situation, it sounds like your mom was very well aware that she set up this whole thing so that she could, one, shame and guilt you guys. Then she gets her way because you come anyway. And then she gets to be praised all night, which is what she really needs. Her ego needs to be reminded how awesomely wonderful she is, and to repair herself, because you would even think about not going.
Well, so this is totally tongue in cheek, my friend. But so basically when you were like, so making the problem, me being the problem, well, you were part of the problem because you fed into it. And then when you decided to not feed into it, there's where the problem came. So yeah, that's, I don't remember that story. Thanks for sharing that again, because wow.
And it's so difficult because you're in the middle of this myriad of stuff. And one of the questions I would want to ask, and feel free to not even respond, is how your wife tolerated it, like in terms of you standing up to her mom and disrupting this dynamic that everybody just played along with forever. Because then that gets really kind of scary it would be scary if for the person who's in your wife's role, so to speak.
Yeah, and that was one area that I wanted to give, because you're really good at this, because that was the next thing I wanted to stop on, is to say, Jamie, I hear what you're saying about, oh, I just fed into it. And I think this is really good for the audience and for people who haven't experienced this, really kind of come away from hearing. Because I don't think I just fell off the turnip truck. I'm quite aware of my surroundings. I also felt handcuffed for a long time. And again, I wish my wife was here so she could speak firsthand. but I'm going to speak kind of on my understanding of what she would say, which I think is pretty close, which is she felt handcuffed, right? Like nobody disrupted the family dynamic. Nobody went against the grain. This is the first time anybody's went against the grain. And she wants a relationship with her mom and, her stepdad and her brothers and sisters. And she wants one with me. So again, it's like, why can't we all get along? And that was the theme for many years, right? Like, why can't we just all get along? Well, okay, we can. Okay, I will bite my tongue just so we can keep peace. And so it was really out of love and respect for my wife that I stayed quiet and I played the part for so long until finally I looked at her and I said, I'm not going to do this anymore. It got to the point where I didn't even feel like I was living my own life at that point. And I can only imagine she would say the same thing. We were living the life that our mother-in-law wanted us to live. And that was the point that I said, if I'm going to spend the rest of my life with you, I'm not going to play by this rule anymore. I'm not going to do it. I can't. And it was years of her being able to see a family dynamic that was different than hers. She grew up always knowing this doesn't feel right, but I don't know what right is, right? She was like, why does a mom act like this? Why does a mom say the things that she's saying to me? Because that doesn't seem to be my limited interaction with my friends when I see that interaction or, you see on TV or whatever. And I would say it was really when she had a front row seat to my family's dynamic and how my mom treated us as, you want to come? If you don't, great. We'd love to have you, but if you can't make it, we understand. And it was really her kind of seeing that to say something's not right here. And truly, I think it took my wife to kind of, I'm going to use the word deprogram, but it's probably wrong, but it felt like that. It felt like she had to almost unlearn everything that her entire childhood and teenage years, and I would say even early adult years had known as fact, had to be reprogrammed. And so it took us time. And so to answer your question, Jamie, I wish I was a little bit stronger and I wish I was a little bit quicker, but I also think it had to go this way because had I just said, no, I'm done, and that for my wife, I could see her not understanding, and then I'm the problem because why are you doing this? When we kind of had to learn that together. And there's a point in my story where we finally get there, and that's when really things take a real bad turn. Does that make sense?
100%. And I think what you described is going along with it. In some ways, you were caught in the middle. In some ways, it was definitely not healthy. And you were, reinforcing it, or you were enabling the narcissism of your mother-in-law, right? But you were also demonstrating healthy personality characteristics. We need to be flexible in different environments. We need to be able to manage. We need to be able to deal with situations. But at some point, where's the line and where's the tipping point? And so like people can do a lot of stuff to me, but don't mess with my kids, and I'm not going to go protect them, but I'm going to empower them to protect themselves and protect them as much as I can as kids and as adults, because that's what moms do. Well, you're in a conundrum, but your wife's in the real conundrum. And, it's a tough situation because she is kind of playing the game. She's also enabling it. She doesn't know that there's anything different. She's seeing something different in your family being modeled. And she's like, oh, this feels good to have unconditional love. Dang. But she was her whole life, your wife, at an unconscious level and or conscious level, craving that. If she just does one more thing of keeping mom happy, mom's going to love me. Mom's going to be able to nurture me. Mom's going to be real. She's not going to be superficial and love everybody else and have this full out spread so she can look good, while your wife's just wanting her to really feel that unconditional love that she's learned from your family to the extreme. I'm jumping some and making some assumptions, but potentially your wife has some of those dynamics of just wanting to be good enough where your mother-in-law needed all the attention. So she probably wasn't capable of really giving that to your wife, possibly. Again, I'm making some assumptions.
I probably need to withdraw my statement too, because truthfully, had you done that, had you cut that off right away, you would have been no better to your wife than her mother, right? You gave her the space to learn and come to those conclusions and make those decisions, which is something that probably hasn't been given to her. before that. So you did the right thing. You did what you had to do. Like, I mean, there was no other option, I don't think. You know what I mean?
Well, and it wasn't until I think that's how I felt it. Now, was I thinking exactly in those terms? No. But yes, how I had to survive and stuff, that's how I was thinking about it until it became to the point where I could not do that anymore. Like there was a breaking point, and that breaking point was seeing my wife hurt over and over and over and over. And finally it was me saying, I hear what you're asking of me. I can no longer fulfill that for you. And here's why. And this is why this is important for me to almost stand up for you when you don't know you need to be stood up for. And I need to stand up for myself. Like, this is not how I want to live my life, is by the guise of somebody else. That's not how this works. This isn't, you get to have a relationship with us, not because you force it or shape it, because we want to have a relationship with you. And right now I don't want to have a relationship with you. That's kind of this headspace I was in. And I was like, things have got to change, and I'm going to start changing them for the better, for no other people other than just my wife and I. So that's really kind of where we're at now in this relationship with my mother-in-law. So
it's pretty phenomenal, because this can be one of the big areas that damages relationships. So like you and your wife's marriage and being able to sustain that, if you would have introduced the limit setting too strong too soon, again, it may have ended your marriage, because I don't know if it's accurate, but part of your wife's role in keeping the peace was, again, just wanting it to be peaceful and wanting something probably from her mother that is never going to happen, but that intrinsic need for that still.
Yeah. So I feel like I'm almost getting like a hero's complex here, where I'm like, I came in on the right time it was really, I mean, there was arguments there was discussions. I just want, without getting into it, I just want there to be a real representation of, there were arguments between my wife and I. Some of them got really heated just because we were trying to figure this out. Again, looking back behind, yeah, I can pinpoint exact things why we were fighting. We weren't mad at each other. We were mad at the situation. And sometimes we were mad at my mother-in-law. But we had to let some of that steam out, because if we didn't, we would have exploded. And so it came out in other ways. For the longest time, it came out in other ways. And I don't know if that's a healthy term or not, but that's what we did. And it did help until it was finally one of us, and it just happened to me, said, no, we're getting off this roller coaster, and we're getting off now. And it started again. It seems to be around the holidays. But we finally said, no, we're not coming back for the holidays. And I have to be very clear, at this point, we started having children. At this point, we moved away. So I got a job. I was not sad that it was outside of where we were living by 5.5 hours. I was nervous. We didn't know anybody. We didn't have any family. So that's the downside. But also the upside is we didn't have my mother-in-law. And so it wasn't hey, we can pop over, because that's what was happening, is I'm going to pop over. Just to give you one example, we had a house where my mother-in-law thought it was her personal rest stop. And when we said, no, you can't use it, we are so selfish. She's a very busy person. How can we not understand that her kids need a place to go and get drinks and go to the bathroom? And we have a perfectly good house, and why she has important business to take care of. Why can't she leave her kids at our house? And she wanted a key to our house, and we said no. And then she tried to take a key and make it. And we were like, you're not getting a key. I got to the point where I said, if I find out you have a key to my house, I'm changing all the locks, and you will be you will not have access to come and go out of my home. Found out later years that was a big conversation between my wife and my mother-in-law on why she can't have a key to our house, and she should be able to. She's the mom. Malin just doesn't like me. I mean, it was a lot of this stuff. And, my wife did ask, is it so bad if she doesn't have a house key? And I said, that was a line. I would not give a house key to my mom and dad. They would never ask. And I'm not giving one to your mom. And that was a big point of contention. A lot of years went by with, if we had a key to the house, this would be a lot easier. Well, you're not getting a key to the house. One of the things that really stuck out to me is that we put a boundary on, if we're not home, you can't drop your kids off. That's just, It's our house. I didn't feel comfortable. Some of them are really small. And what she wanted to do is she wanted to drop them off so she could go run her errands or do her business and then come back and pick up her kids. We said no. And one particular time, it was in the summer. It was very hot. I was just getting out of school, was coming home before I had to go to work. I show up and there are 4 kids on my front porch. Now, mind you, my front porch is not air conditioned or heated in this house. They could not get into my home. They were all sitting on the porch, and my mother-in-law dropped them off because she had errands to do, she had business to do, and it was like 100 degrees. I mean, it was hot. And we were talking from like maybe 13, 14, all the way down to 3 or 4-year-old. And I remember I was so mad. I was so angry because why would you leave your children on a hot porch unattended at my house? Like, that makes me liable for kids that I don't want to be liable for when I'm not there. And I'll never forget when it was brought up. It was, well, that wouldn't have happened if you just give me a key. So it's my fault. It's our fault that her kids were unsafe because she didn't have a house key into our house. It didn't even cross her mind, or she couldn't even accept the fact that, no, as a parent, as an adult, it's your responsibility not to leave your kids in harm's way or in an environment where they can get hurt. And that's exactly what you did. And again, it was, well, if you would give me a key to the house, that wouldn't have happened. Unbelievable.
Yes, unbelievable. So when we talk about the extremes, when you catch yourself catching your breath, or you're automatically having gestures, or when those situations happen, it's a good likelihood that it's related to, say, the personality disorder, or in this case, the dynamics you're describing, narcissism. So much like we briefly touched on all or nothing thinking, the splitting, boundaries tend to be very horrible because guess what? Everything is about me if I'm narcissistic. So I won't even go there to think that it's your fault that you didn't have that it's my fault that my kids sit on your porch, because yeah, you should have given me the key because I deserve it because I am who I am. Again, I'm being sarcastic, right? But that's the mindset. That's the self-fulfilled, indulging self-love. It's artificial, but that's the mindset. And that's the internal experience of the narcissist. And it sounds like there's kind of a combination. It'd be really interesting to dive into your mother-in-law's childhood and that sounds very shrinky, didn't it? But to their childhood and see, like, is it more like, was she overindulged or was she somehow underindulged? And it doesn't matter. That just helps understand it. And it helps to reinforce validating what's going on with the dynamic. But the things that you're describing, it's a different version of the same verse, or a different verse that in the same song that you hear over and over when you talk about families who have to deal with narcissism. And whether you call it a mental illness or if you say it's a personality disorder, it is devastating to family dynamics. And it really does disrupt children. It does disrupt marriages of those people who enter into those systems. One of the things that we haven't talked about, and I don't know if you're going to, of like how you deal with that with your own children, then that like you don't want them to see this as a healthy model. The last thing I would want to do is have my children to think that this is okay, or the passivity of the grandpa is okay. But like, I don't want my son growing up to be that passive, right? So that's my piece. It'll see where it goes.
Hey, everyone. We're going to take a little break for the other half of this conversation. It was such a great conversation with Dr. Krista that we went really long on this one. So we're going to cut this into 2 parts, and you can join us again in 2 weeks. We will have the other half of our conversation with Dr. Krista about narcissism. We hope you've enjoyed it so far, but stay tuned because the other half is coming. So thanks for listening, and we hope to see you next time around the roundtable. Have a great week. Bye-bye.